Hello, and welcome to this introduction to Islam. I'm Dr. George Archer. For each class discussion, you'll have to watch one or more videos like this one about various issues of Islamic studies. Please watch them carefully and take detailed notes. You're going to need these notes to participate in class discussion and prepare for your examinations. For each video, I will ask you a number of questions. In class, I will randomly select students to answer these questions. You're welcome to read answers you prepared at home, but be ready to elaborate on what you said if I ask you for more information. A large part of your final grade for the semester will come from class participation, and that grade will mostly come from your ability to answer these questions in class when you're called on, in detail, and using your own words. If you feel that you cannot answer one of the questions from the videos, it's incumbent upon you to resolve the issue before coming to class. Of course, the best place to start would be simply to rewatch the assignment. But if that doesn't help, you're encouraged to reach out to me through email, come to office hours, or set up an appointment. If you're called on in class and you can't answer straightforward questions, and you made no effort to correct the confusion with me, or if your answers are simply short or lacking in detail, or simply verbatim information straight out of the video, then your course participation grade will drop significantly. And by the way, if you're confused, I'd like to encourage you not to look up answers on the internet. It's not that there isn't good information about Islam and Islamic studies on the internet. There is, lots of it actually. But unfortunately, the vast majority of the information out there is either not reliable or can't be trusted. So, before you come to class next time, be able to answer these following questions. What are the meanings of the term Islam and Muslim? How can we try to define Islam by what is popular? Where is Islam popular? What is problematic about defining Islam by popularity? How can we attempt to define Islam by a shared vocabulary? Why can it be deceptive to define Islam this way? Who and what would any Muslim agree has authority in Islam? What is Allah, Wahi, Quran, Rasul, and Nabi? What does it mean to define Islam by what is intelligibly Islamic? Before we get into the study of Islam, it's probably best to ask what Islam is. But that's not an easy question to answer. Since most of you aren't that familiar with Islam, I'm going to guess that most of you wouldn't be ready to produce a definition of Islam off the cuff. So instead, let's start by looking at a phenomenon that you're much more familiar with, as a kind of analogy. Imagine we had to define the English language. You speak English yourself, and so if I ask you, what is considered English and why? You can do that, right? So there's a number of different ways we could possibly try to define English. We could argue from popularity. What is most popular, according to English language speakers, is what defines English. The words and the grammars that are most common to English speakers are called English. But in that case, regional variations of English wouldn't be considered English. So, for instance, Americans who speak English call a machine that takes you up and down in a building an elevator. But a British English speaker would probably call the same machine a lift. So, because there are more Americans than Brits, does that mean that the American use of elevator is correct, while the British use of lift is incorrect? That doesn't seem right. Likewise, Defining English in terms of what is popular means that slang isn't English, even though many English speakers can understand numerous kinds of slang perfectly well, and would presumably identify it as English. What about defining English by vocabulary? Perhaps there are certain words that are considered English, and to speak those words is to speak English. So, hello, good morning, and goodbye are English, while hola, buenos dias, and adios are not English. But then English is rather porous, and the lines between English and other languages are fuzzy at best. Even if English is the only language you speak, you may full well know what hola, buenos dias, and adios mean, like many English speakers do. And vice versa. There may be rare words that few English speakers know, like chthonic or akimbo. But if English is defined by its vocabulary, and the words chthonic and akimbo are not in common use, does that mean that they're not English, or that they're somehow less English than much more commonly understood words, like hola or adios? We could try to define English based on authority. If there's someone or some group that many people consider authoritative, maybe they can define English. Maybe like the authors of English dictionaries or English language scholars. Do these people define English? If a word is in an English dictionary or a scholarly book, it must be English. Whereas if a word would not be found in an English dictionary or a scholarly book, then it's not English. But dictionary authors and scholars don't agree on everything. There are supposedly English language words in some dictionaries that might not be in others. And there are English words that some scholars would use that others would not. So, defining English by apparent authorities doesn't work either. And who's to say who's authoritative anyway? People could easily disagree on who's an authority when it comes to English, or even claim that no one person or group has the power to define English. What about history? Can we define English by its history? If a word has a long history of being used by English speakers, then it's an English word. Well, not so fast, because most words that would normally be referred to as English aren't that old, and many others have changed meanings, spellings, and nuance over the centuries. For example, most English speakers would know the words thee and thou, even if they don't use them often. Thee and thou were for many centuries the second-person singular pronoun. It's what you would call a single person when not referring to them by name. Meanwhile, the word you was once the plural second-person pronoun only. It's what you would use to speak to a group of people. 500 years ago, an English speaker would tell her spouse, "I love thee." "I love you" would mean that she loved a whole group of people. Now in modern English, you fulfills both of these functions at once, while thee and thou are rarely used at all anymore. And yet thee and thou are not unknown. But now they carry a sense of extreme formality and deliberate old-fashionedness. Thee and thou sound biblical. But thee and thou didn't used to be like that at all. They were just the standard words that you would use for anyone. The meaning of thee, thou, and you have all shifted dramatically over the ages. So, which meaning is correct English? On top of that, there are perfectly English words that are now completely extinct. For instance, here's a selection from the poem Beowulf, written in English around the year 1000. This is all English, but few of these words are still in use. If history defines English, well, then we have another issue. The historical use of English has changed so much that it's hard to say that this passage from Beowulf and the language that I'm speaking right now are the same language at all. and yet they're both English. How about we define English through intelligibility? Rather than being a fixed, constant phenomena defined by dictionaries or history, English is more like a community of people, or a trend or a tendency that's only known in a particular context. What people in a certain community at a certain place and time understand collectively is called English, if that's what they label it. So English is like a custom, which is only meaningful in particular settings. The fact that the English of Beowulf and the English of Shakespeare are quite different is of no consequence. If you lived in the 11th century historical setting in which Beowulf was written, you could correctly understand the poem as English. And if you lived in Elizabethan England when Shakespeare lived, you could correctly understand Shakespeare's plays and poems as English. And the fact that neither the poem Beowulf nor Shakespeare's works resemble English in 21st century Mumbai means nothing at all, because the custom called English in 21st century Mumbai is perfectly intelligible to people in that setting. But if this is the case, that means that there's nothing constant and universal about English. English is only what it is in a given moment of history. No one thought, word, concept, grammar, or trend defines English in all possible times and places. There is nothing that is innately English ever. How do we solve this problem and define English? Well, frankly, we don't. There's no one way to define English. It's just too big, complicated, and too diverse to have one single way to define it throughout. But what we can do is use each of these methods of defining English, turning to popularity, shared vocabulary, authority claims, histories, and intelligibility, and use each one in turn. But keeping in mind that each way of defining English comes with problems too. English is complex, and so it stands to reason that any attempt to define it must come at it from lots of different angles and use a lot of different methods. This kind of problem gets even worse when it comes to defining Islam. Islam is a bigger, more diverse phenomenon than even English is. We cannot define it in any meaningfully detailed way head-on. But what we can do is look for what is popular, shared vocabulary, various authority claims, historical patterns, and shared kinds of intelligibility, while always remembering that no one of these methods is foolproof. What is popularly considered Islam? The word Islam, is Arabic for submission or pacification, meaning to make yourself at peace with something, usually in reference to making yourself at peace with God. So the term Islam tells us there are some conditions in which people or other agents are in submission to God, and that would be Islam, while there are others that are not in submission to God, and so we could say that is not Islam. The word for one who submits, a submitter, is a Muslim. The words Muslim and Islam are directly related. Just as in English, there's a straightforward linguistic connection between submission and submitter. In Arabic, there's a direct linguistic connection between Islam and Muslim. Like a submitter performs submission, a Muslim is one who performs Islam. Today, there are about 1.6 to 1.9 billion people on Earth who would identify themselves as Muslims. And since Islam isn't restricted only to living people, we have to account for Muslims in the past as well. If we look back over history, There have been somewhere between 10 and 20 billion people who have called themselves Muslims. Numbers like that should give us pause. That is an awful lot of people. That is more people than are alive in the entire world today. They all call themselves by the same word, Muslim. But 10 billion or more people is by definition going to be a very, very diverse population. Today, the largest single Muslim population in the world is found in Indonesia, where there are about 250 million people who call themselves Muslims. After that is Pakistan and India, both of which have about the same number of Muslims, 200 million in each nation. Then there's Bangladesh, with about 150 million Muslims. Nigeria, with 95 million Muslims. Iran, with 80 million. Turkey, with 75 million. And Egypt also with about 75 million Muslims. There are about 50 nations in the world right now, including all of these, save India, where there is a majority Muslim population. And of course, there are also sizable Muslim minorities found in lots of other places. For just a few examples, in the United Kingdom, there are about 4 million Muslims. In Germany, there are approximately the same number, 4 million. In the United States, there are about 3.5 million. And in Spain, there are about 2 million. We can keep going like this if we want, but we would find that there is a Muslim population in nearly every country on Earth. And again, we can also account for Muslim populations, both majorities and minorities, in places that no longer exist. The kingdoms, nations, and empires of the past. There are Muslim majorities in about 300 different ethnic groups, most of which have their own distinctive languages and cultures. And again, there are Muslim minorities in many other ethnic communities, whose numbers exceed our guess. So, this raises the question: can we define Islam by what is popularly Islam? By where and with whom Islam is popular? Is Islam whatever the majority of Muslims do and think? Well, in a certain sense, yeah, we can talk that way a little bit. There is something much more Islamic about Sudan, where there are 40 million Muslims, than there is about Iceland, where there are less than 1,000 Muslims. But it can get deceptive. Is Indonesia more definitively Islamic than Turkey because it just has more Muslims? Do Indonesians define Islam just because there are many of them? Or is India less Islamic than Egypt, even though India has more than twice as many Muslims as Egypt does? But there, in India, they're not a majority like they are in Egypt. And what about very small minorities? There are only about 2,000 Muslims in Haiti. Does that mean that Haitian Islam isn't significant? Or that Haiti doesn't tell us something unique about Islam? So, to get around this issue, we're going to keep tabs on popularity. But we can't let popularity define Islam either. Just because a great number of Muslims do or think something, that doesn't mean that it defines Islam per se. Muslim minorities may have just as much to say about Islam as majorities do. If something is popular for many Muslims, we should certainly keep note of that. But neither should we just ignore rare or unpopular presentations of Islam either. Next, we can ask, what is the shared vocabulary of Islam? Like a language, Islam does have a certain vocabulary of sorts. There are certain thoughts, terms, and worldviews that can be called Islamic, just as there are others that can be called not Islamic. The only problem is saying which is which. And again, it gets a little complicated. On the most basic level, nearly all of the shared vocabulary of Islam, thoughts and terms that all or most Muslims have in common, come from the Arabic language. There are historical reasons for this that we're not going to get into now. But just make note that Islam does not equal Arabic, and Arabic does not equal Islam. Neither does Arab equal Muslim, nor does Muslim equal Arab. Arab is an ethnic group, and Arabic is their ancestral language. While the majority of Arabs are Muslims, there are sizable populations of Christian Arabs across the Arab world, a number of Arab Jews, and in the past, Arab pagans and some other groups too. Conversely, most Muslims are not Arabs and do not speak Arabic themselves. About 15% of Muslims today are ethnically Arabs, and there are populations of non-Arab Muslims across the world who speak or read Arabic as a second language. But being an Arab, or knowing Arabic, is still a minority of Muslims by far. That said, there is a special relationship between Islam and Arabic, so we're going to have to know something about the Arabic language. Yet just as Indonesians do not necessarily define Islam because of their large numbers, Arabs do not necessarily define Islam because their ancestral language is so important to it. Arabic is the most popular of the Semitic languages, the family of languages that includes Hebrew, the biblical language of the Jewish people, Akkadian, the now extinct language of ancient Mesopotamia, Aramaic, a language of many ancient Jews and Christians, including, famously, Jesus, Syriac, formerly the most common liturgical language of Eastern Christianity, Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, and Amharic, the language of modern Ethiopia. These languages, including Arabic, are not at all related to English. And so, unfortunately, there are many sounds, thoughts, and words that we're going to find in Arabic that have no real English equivalent. That means you're going to have to learn some Arabic words in order to study Islam. I will try my very best to keep the Arabic to a minimum, since I know that learning new words is a pain, and even more so when those words are radically unlike English. However, there's no way around this entirely. To understand something about Islam, you have to know some Arabic terms and names. Arabic, like all Semitic languages, is built upon a root system of usually 3 sounds. By manipulating how these sounds are spelled or vocalized, the Arabic speaker can create new words. For example, any Arabic word that contains the sounds S, L, and M in that order probably has something to do with the notion of peace. Islam, submission, means to be at peace with something. The word Muslim, a submitter, is one who is at peace with something. And the order of the sounds of those root letters never change, just how you vocalize them. So in both Islam and Muslim, the order is S, L, and M. Now, you don't have to know too much about how this root system works if you don't know any Arabic. However, it will come up from time to time. In Arabic, the root is part of the definition of nearly all words, and those roots are very obvious to an Arabic speaker. If you know any Arabic, you will see the roots almost immediately. There's nothing like this in English, and so it's hard to demonstrate. But just know that when we meet a new word, and I mentioned that word's root, it's important to understanding the meaning of the word, even if the meaning of the root isn't actually part of the word's definition. English and Arabic don't define words the same way, so when we mention the root of an Arabic term, just know that it's something lost in translation. Next problem. Arabic has a number of letters and sounds that don't exist in English. So, if you see the common Islamic expression, Assalamualaikum, peace be unto you. Again, the word salam, peace, uses S, L, and M in that order. There's going to be some symbols that don't mean anything to you if you don't know any Arabic. For instance, there are diacritical markers over the A and the U, and a little floating letter C over the word alaikum. These sorts of things are there for those of you who do know some Arabic, so that you know exactly how to spell Assalamu alaikum in the Arabic alphabet. But for those of you who don't know any Arabic, don't sweat it. Just ignore these markers of Arabic that aren't standard English and pronounce to the best of your ability. This isn't an Arabic class. You're welcome to just write Assalamu alaikum like this, without all the little symbols that aren't normally used in English. One more little note about this. Although Arabic is very important to Muslims, whether they're Arabs themselves or not, Arabic is not the only language that's important to understanding Islam either. So, while much of the shared vocabulary of Muslims comes from the Arabic language, that doesn't mean that Arabic defines Islam or that Islam defines Arabic. In this course, we will also meet other terms and names from common languages spoken by Muslims. We'll meet terms and names from Persian, also called Farsi, Urdu, Turkish, Mongolian, and a few others. Next we can ask, what is authority in Islam? If we can define Islam by Muslim populations, but not always, and we can define Islam by a shared vocabulary of Arabic words and thoughts, but not always, can we define Islam by authority? In other words, who has the power to define what Islam is and what it's not? The immediate answer here would have to be God. God defines Islam. And keeping in mind the shared Arabic vocabulary of Islam, God would often be called Allah, the Arabic word for God. But, like we just learned, Arabic isn't distinct to Islam, and Islam is not distinct to Arabic. Anyone who speaks the Arabic language would call God Allah, whether they were Muslim, Christian, Jewish, atheist, or anything else. An Arabic Bible would call God Allah, and there were people calling the biblical God Allah even before the appearance of Islam in history. Actually, the word Allah is directly related to Aramaic terms like Ilaha or Allaha that Jesus himself would have used, or the ancient term Elohim used in the Hebrew Bible. This matter gets a little confusing because many Muslims who don't speak Arabic will still call God Allah in other languages too, including English. Again, even though Arabic does not define Islam, Arabic has a very special place in the hearts and minds of Muslims. And so calling God by this Arabic term is a conventional act of piety. However, that also causes a bit of confusion for non-Muslims who don't know Arabic. Often non-Muslims think that Allah is a divine being worshipped by Muslims, while Jews and Christians worship God. This is incorrect. God means Allah, and Allah means God. God is not distinct to Islam or to Muslims, and not all Muslims exclusively use this Arabic word when they talk about the deity. While there are significant differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this is not one of them. It's actually just a common linguistic confusion. So, to keep it clear, I'm going to use the word God alone throughout this course. That said, if God is the authority who defines Islam, what does God say Islam is? Since God is not immediate in the material sense of the term, God's authority has to be made known to Muslims through agents that God has revealed, sent, or created. The most important way that God is known for Muslims is through wahi, revelation. Again, if you don't know what that little dot under the H means, don't worry about it. Wahi means to uncover something that is normally hidden, or to express something that isn't obvious. It literally just means communication, but it refers implicitly to the communication between God and created beings, such as humans. There are many examples of wahi for Muslims. By far the most important one is a series of oral recitals called the Quran. The Quran is a collection of chanted performances. The word Quran literally means recitation, something said out loud in a fixed and regular way. Although the Quran is often written down in book form, that's kind of incidental. Just like music is sound, but it can be written down on paper, the Quran is a sound that can be written in a book. But, strictly speaking, the Quran is something that can be recited and heard aloud first, and only later is it something written and read. Muslims generally consider the Quran to be the primary example of communication, wahi, between God and the human race. It isn't the only one, though. We'll meet others later. God also speaks through human beings in a variety of ways. The most important is through prophets and messengers. A prophet, a nabi, or the plural anbiya, is someone who speaks for God on earth. Someone who has the ability to say something on God's behalf. Many prophets have come to remind people to turn to God and to live moral lives. Some, but not all of the prophets, also have another function. Amongst these anbiya, or prophets, are people who bring specific texts or law codes. That is, that bring a message, like a book, a recitation, or a fixed body of teachings. A prophet who also brings a specific message is called a messenger, a rasul, plural rasul. Since one category overlaps the other, people often confuse nabi, a prophet, and rasul, a messenger. Not every prophet is a messenger, but all messengers are, by definition, prophets too. A rasul must be a nabi, that means a messenger must be a prophet. But a nabi doesn't have to be a rasul. A prophet isn't always a messenger. So, anyone appointed by God to speak to other people and tell them to worship God aright and treat each other accordingly is a nabi, a prophet. And a nabi, a prophet, who also brings a fixed message, like a text or a law code, is a messenger, a rasul as well. The most significant prophet, nabi, is Muhammad, the rasul, messenger, who brought the Quran. He was born sometime around the year 570 of the Christian calendar, and he died in 632. He lived in western central Arabia, first in the town of Mecca, and then later in the town of Yathrib, which in time would be called Medina. But Muhammad is not the only prophet or messenger from God either. We'll meet more. And there are other human authorities who can be said to speak on behalf of Islam too. but these are a bit more debatable. There are various individuals, families, groups, and institutions, like scholars, schools, jurists, saints, local wise people, poets, mystics, or political figures, who large number of Muslims may consider authorities on Islam. But which of these people is authoritative, and to what degree, and what that authority means, varies quite a bit based on which Muslim you ask. The only human beings that any Muslim would certainly agree is authoritative regarding Islam would be the prophets and the messengers. Other than prophets and messengers, there is no human authority in Islam that everyone agrees on. Anyone a certain Muslim considers an authority, minus the prophets, would not be considered an authority to some other Muslims somewhere else. Okay, can we define Islam by its history? To an extent, yes. Now, for Muslims, this could be taken in three different ways. First, we can discuss Islam as a universal part of the human condition, which can be applied to all times and places. Islam is submission to God, and since humans can always submit to God, Islam is as universal to humans as dreaming or singing are. Islam is just something humans do sometimes. As God is not limited to just one time and place, submission to this God can be identified across history. Anywhere, at any time, when someone submits to God, we can call this Islam. Unfortunately, defining Islam this way gets a bit tricky. Most people, in most times and places, would not define themselves using the Arabic words Islam or Muslim, so we would have to impose a category on them that they wouldn't use for themselves. Asking if a person who submitted to God in ancient Egypt and whether they would have called themselves a Muslim is kind of like asking if someone in ancient Egypt would have called themselves a democratic socialist or a conservative. They wouldn't have categories like that, even if there are certain parallels between their various forms of thought. And so, to identify someone in a way they never could possibly have identified themselves is always going to take some guesswork. Second, we can also discuss Islam as a more particular historical phenomenon that began in just one time and place: Arabia, in the early 7th century of the Christian calendar. That is, the time when Muhammad lived and when the Quran first appeared. Any Muslim would agree that that time and place in history defines Islam somehow. And so, if you want to know something about Islam, we have to know something about 7th century Arabia and the historical figure named Muhammad. And then we hit a snag, too, actually. There is something very important about 7th century Arabia's relationship to Islam. But never should we assume that the events and peoples of that time and place fully define Islam for all times and places. What exactly happened in 7th century Arabia is subject to serious historical questions, and very little can be said with absolute confidence. And while there are books and scholars beyond count who claim to know what happened in this important time and place in history, first-hand historical data of the period is extraordinarily rare. Indeed, the largest rift between the historical community of the world's Muslims is over a simple question of what exactly happened in Arabia in the 7th century. So, while many Muslims, but absolutely not all, claim to practice the Islam practiced in 7th century Arabia, we should not assume that they are correct, or that they even know what happened in 7th century Arabia. No one does, not unquestionably anyway. Furthermore, to define Islam by 7th century Arabia is to ignore the vast complexity and many developments that also define Islam, most of which did not occur in Arabia. To repeat, most Muslims are not Arabs, and add on top of that, very, very few Muslims lived in the 7th century. Just because something was said or done by a 7th century Arabian Muslim, that means nothing at all about Islam per se. Just because something is clearly Islamic, too, that doesn't necessarily mean it has roots in 7th century Arabia. And so that takes us to our third way of defining Islam by its history. We can discuss Islam in other historical situations that came after the time of Muhammad. What is Islam to someone living in 10th century Baghdad, or 18th century Cairo, or the 21st century in the American Midwest? That is, Islam can be spoken of as the distinct histories of any time and place where there are people who call themselves Muslims. Now, the shortcoming of this approach is that it's particular. Islam's history in rural Malaysia doesn't tell us anything about Islam's history in coastal Jordan, and neither tells us anything about Islam's history in Toronto, Canada. Just as we should never assume that the history of Arabia defines Islam, even if someone claims that it does, no one history defines Islam everywhere. So here in this course, we're going to define Islam by its history, using each of these three different methods. We're going to look at how Islam manifested itself in many different times and places, how Islam manifested itself in 7th century Arabia specifically, and how Islam manifests itself in history generally as a universal part of the human situation. But we're never going to claim that Islam can be fully defined by any one history. It isn't, and it can't be. So, what is intelligibly Islamic? All of these different ways of defining Islam are somewhat imperfect. We can define Islam by what is popularly considered Islam, but if we do that, minority opinions disappear. It's smart to keep tabs on widely held notions of what Islam is, but neither should we conclude that a popular idea is necessarily correct, or that an unpopular idea isn't important. And we can define Islam by the common vocabulary of Muslims, all the thoughts and words that Muslims use to express this thing called Islam. But that will unfortunately create a very Arabic-centric version of what Islam is. Since most common Islamic vocabulary is from Arabic, thinking this way might trick us into believing that Islam is a distinctly Arabic phenomenon, or that Arabic is distinct to Muslims. But not all Arabs are Muslims, and the vast majority of Muslims aren't Arabs. And we can define Islam by authority. But who and what and why something is authoritative in Islam is always debatable somehow. Sure, any Muslim would agree that God defines Islam, but there's no single vision of what God is that all Muslims everywhere share. There are countless different interpretations of God in Islam. Likewise, all Muslims would agree that the Quran is authoritative in Islam. But the meaning of the Quran is debated amongst different Muslim groups. How the Quran is to be interpreted, and by who, has been discussed and presented in infinite varieties across Islamic history. And again, all Muslims would concur that Muhammad and the other prophets and messengers are authoritative. But once more, how they're authoritative, and in what ways, is subject to radical disagreements. And again, finally, neither is there any single consensus on any other human authority who attempts to interpret God, the Quran, or the prophets. History can define Islam too, but not all Muslims share the same history. All Muslims presumably would think that there's something very important about 7th century Arabia when Muhammad lived. But what exactly is so important about that time and place isn't agreed upon by all Muslims. What even happened in that time and place is not agreed upon by all historians. And the Islamic histories of other times and places define Islam, But these are by definition multitudinous. The history of Islam for someone from Bangladesh will not be the same as the history of Islam for an Algerian. If we define Islam by its history, then we'll have as many Islamic histories as we have Muslims, as each Muslim has their own historical context, which usually has little to do with Muslims in other times and places. So, to stop ourselves from going off the deep end and concluding that Islam is totally undefinable, we can ask ourselves what is intelligibly Islamic. What can be possibly called Islam reasonably? Returning for a moment to the analogy I used at the beginning about asking what defines English, it would be like saying, I think that wanna is an English word. Whatever you think about the claim, the fact that the claim is at least understood by any English speaker means that it's intelligible. Even if you do not agree that wanna is an English or proper English word, you understand the argument perfectly well. And so back to Islam. If someone refers to themselves as a Muslim, and something they think or do as Islam, and we at least understand what they're talking about, well then we can use that to define Islam a little bit more. In this course, anyone, anywhere, who honestly refers to themselves as a Muslim can be offered as evidence for what Islam is. That does not mean that we have to agree with them, or that they're right, but only we recognize that they are intelligibly Islamic. We will encounter different Islamic voices that are actively fighting with each other about what Islam is or should be. It isn't our problem in this course to resolve the issue, even if we're absolutely sure that one side is correct and defines Islam better than another. If someone says, Islam is X, and you strongly and confidently disagree, but you at least understand what they're claiming, that is, what they have said is intelligibly Islamic to you, then they've still told us something about Islam. For instance, if there's a Muslim man who says that women are second-class citizens and they should never be in public without a male escort, and he says that this is because of Islam, we have to take his claim seriously, whether we like it or not, and whether we agree or not. Vice versa. If there's a Muslim feminist who says that women are morally, intellectually, and legally men's equals, and she says that this is because of Islam, we're going to listen to what she has to say. It will not be our business here to say someone's interpretation of Islam is correct or incorrect. Whether you like a practice or an opinion, or agree with it, if someone calls themselves a Muslim and claims that it's an expression of Islam, we're going to consider that useful data, even if we think that they're wrong, misguided, or even evil. If their argument is intelligibly Islamic, we're going to listen to them. Now, we can personally be critical of their claim, but we will not dismiss them without allowing them a chance to be heard. But then again, to think this way means that there's nothing that's definitively Islamic always. Even if we say all Muslims believe in God or grant authority to Wahi, there's such radical diversity in what God and Wahi may mean, that claiming such wouldn't provide us with much useful information either. Indeed, many Muslims may even reject being defined by beliefs in such ways altogether, instead arguing that Islam is a way of life, or a moral system, a series of rituals, an aesthetic, a common narrative, and so on. And all these sorts of definitions are just as equally generic and open to interpretations beyond reckoning. And so, we're going to have to check defining Islam by intelligibility, since it can lead to a free-for-all, by tempering this approach with our earlier questions. After wondering whether this phenomenon is intelligibly Islamic, we will ask, is this phenomenon popularly considered Islamic? Does this phenomenon employ an Islamic vocabulary, and how? Who and what does this phenomenon claim is an authority in Islam? And how does this phenomenon fit into the different Islamic visions of history, So again, before you come to class, be able to answer the following questions in your own words. I'm going to call on you at random. What are the meanings of the terms Islam and Muslim? How can we try to define Islam by what is popular? Where is Islam popular? And what's problematic about defining Islam by its popularity? How can we attempt to define Islam by a shared vocabulary? Why can it be deceptive to define Islam this way? Who and what would any Muslim agree has authority in Islam? What is Allah, Wahi, Quran, Rasul, and Nabi? What does it mean to define Islam by what is intelligibly Islamic?